Jeff Fuller back with you. Jay Fuller Interviews. Thank you so much for making the time to be a part and join. You can certainly follow online Jay Fuller Interviews on YouTube, the Facebook group, Instagram, and Twitter. Joining me now, we have Gary Noesner. Gary, so good to have you on.
It's a pleasure to be with you today, Jeff.
And so I just want to get started. The Department of Justice, Federal Bureau of Investigation, the rumor is that when you were a kid, you watched a movie or something like that, and you knew you wanted to be a part of the FBI. Is that a decision your parents were excited about, or were they nervous that you wanted to pursue that as a career?
Well, I was probably about 8 years old when I saw that television show about the FBI, and my mother was very supportive and went out and bought me a book about the FBI, a child's book. But later on, when I got old enough to seriously contemplate getting in the FBI, my father was a bit skeptical about the profession, but always supportive nonetheless. So, yeah.
So Gary, I find it fascinating. Your book, Stalling for Time, and we're going to get to the Waco series in a little bit. But man, I heard an interview that you did, and the host was saying that any one of your stories could probably be turned into a movie. Did you anticipate that much action? There's probably a better word, but when you were first getting into becoming a negotiator?
I mean, I don't recall. I mean, I thought being a hostage negotiator was a very brand new thing in the FBI when I got involved in the program. I mean, I knew it would be exciting and challenging, and I hoped it would be interesting, but I don't think I had any sense of how engaging it would be in my life and how, in essence, life-altering it was because of the many things I worked.
And then I believe I asked you off air if you had read the book, Never Split the Difference by Chris Voss, and then you said that you actually trained Chris. Can you talk about what it was like for you to become a trainer after having so much hands-on eyewitness experience?
Yeah, Chris worked for me in the crisis negotiation unit. He's a great guy and a great negotiator. And, you know, I've read his book, and his is more business oriented than mine is, but I think he does a real good job with it. One of the interesting challenges, or I'd say benefits, of work in the FBI is a lot of what we do is, or did at the time, is train police. Particularly in the early days that I was involved in this, the police didn't have a lot of money for training, and the FBI, as part of its mission, would provide that for free. So, you know, as soon as I became trained as a negotiator, I started training those skills in turn to police officers, you know, around the United States. And through being an instructor, it certainly forces you to really know your material very, very well, and also provide you contacts with police officers that help you benefit from the experiences that they've had, and help you fine tune the skill sets required to be successful.
So I know as a parent, when you are negotiating with your children, we always have the trump card of because I said so, I'm the parent. But sometimes in law enforcement, it doesn't work out so well. Did you always have what some would say a compassionate side, and that's what helped you with negotiating? Or when did you first realize that when you tried to fight force with force, things didn't turn out as well?
Well, I think I had some natural personality attributes that made me probably be effective as a negotiator. But certainly you learn through trial and error, the school of hard knocks, however you want to say it, that, you know, approaching a problem with honey, to use the old term, is better than with vinegar.
Yeah.
You know, going back to your opening comment on this question, he's falling out of popularity now, but Bill Cosby used to have a great line about parents aren't interested in justice, they want quiet.
Right.
And I suppose there's some parallels with law enforcement, but we've really learned that, you know, we're public servants. The public expects us to exercise no more force than is absolutely necessary to enforce the law, to bring perpetrators, hostage takers included, to justice. So, you know, it's a standard we have to uphold, and most importantly, we've learned that when we negotiate in a thoughtful manner and we effectuate a successful surrender, which we do in about a 90 percentile, that we're really, in essence, saving our fellow police officers from having to go into a dangerous situation and possibly be injured or killed and not return home to their family. So we don't just negotiate because it's warm and fuzzy and the public likes that. We do it because it has very practical consequences to the outcome.
Gary, when you were approached to write Stalling for Time, what was that process like? Is that something that you always knew you wanted to share these stories, or did you have to be convinced to put this into a book?
Well, I've always enjoyed writing. I'd never written a book before, and I came to appreciate the fact that because of the position I was in as the chief of the crisis negotiation unit, I had some pretty unusual and pretty extraordinary experiences that the average person just doesn't have. So probably the last 4 or 5, 6 years of my career, so many of my colleagues, both in the FBI and law enforcement, really strongly urged me to write a book. And they said, "You just been involved in too many things not to share this." So I thought about it more and more, and the idea appealed to me more and more. And I was actually retired for 5 years working as a consultant full-time for an international risk consultancy, and was really too busy to take the project on. But I'd always had a 5-year goal to sort of work after the FBI. And so when I hit that 5 years, I said, I think it's time to sit down and write a book. And so I have a friend who's an author who recommended his literary agent, and that made all the difference in the world. And was fortunate enough to have Random House pay me to write the book. So that was good.
And so my friend is a state trooper here in Vermont, and he often shares that it is not like Bad Boys or the movies that you see, but there is a lot of paperwork that you have to fill out and complete after. Being so detailed in those reports, did that help you with your recall in writing this book?
Yeah. And you actually could have touched on it further. I think the biggest help I had in writing the book is in the unit I worked, we had 3 functions. We did research on negotiations. We obviously responded operationally, and then we also did instruction. Those 3 complementary requirements really made us look at every situation we worked, not only from the standpoint of assessing it to see what we did right and wrong, but as an instructor, are there teaching points here? Are there lessons learned here that we can then incorporate in what we share with police officers? So yes, absolutely. By being an instructor and telling those stories, it enabled me later on to put pen to paper. So almost all the stories in the book that are in my book, Stalling for Time, had already been used by me in oral presentations to classes. So I just had to put those ideas and those key lessons down on paper. By the way, you've got a picture of my hardback up there. I'm not even sure that they could still get those. This is a picture of the paperback.
Yeah.
When the television show came out 2 years ago, initially on the Paramount Network, and you've got a picture of it up there now. Random House decided to, almost after 10 years, 8 years at that time of the book being out, to finally move to a paperback version and an audio book version, which I read. So, yeah, so that was sort of created a lot of renewed interest in the book with that show coming out, particularly the last couple of months on Netflix.
So talk to me when you were approached, or how did that all happen, that they said they were going to make a TV show, a miniseries about specifically that Waco experience. And man, this guy, and I just forgot his name, I had it written down, but the actor that plays you, this guy is phenomenal. Did you know much about him when he was cast as your character?
His name's Michael Shannon, and he's twice been nominated for an Academy Award. He's quite an accomplished actor and very well known in acting circles for his immense talents. I had seen him on Boardwalk Empire.
Yes.
And funny enough, I didn't even know his name then, but he left me with a very strong impression. I said, this guy is really good. And then I kind of forgot about him. I'd watched a couple seasons of that. And then all of a sudden they said, well, it's Michael Shannon. I said, well, who is this? And they sent me his picture and I said, oh, it's that guy, and we ended up spending a lot of time together on the set and became friends. And he's just a tremendous person and a credible actor. And I think he certainly did me justice and probably portrayed me better than I am in real life. But yeah, it was a very interesting process to be part of that.
So with your book, Stalling for Time, when it has numerous stories, did you feel like people took advantage only pulling out the Waco story, or were you just proud to have your book being highlighted and this story being told again?
Well, when I wrote the book, there was a couple reasons. It's just sort of autobiographical. I felt as though there really had not been much in the way of literature that talked about what negotiators do and why they do it. There had been stories about people's personal, experience, but there hadn't really been a book that said, here's why we do it, here's how we think, here's how we're set up, and here's how we respond, and here's why it works. And I did that through telling my personal journey, but telling stories of cases I was involved in and knew about. So what happened? The Dowdle brothers, who were the producer directors of the 6-part Waco miniseries, when Paramount hired them to do a film, a 6-part series on Waco, they had been in touch with David Thibodeau, who's one of the Davidian survivors, and he had written a book. So they had the inside look from the Davidians looking out at the FBI, and they were looking for a resource that covered the FBI's view of what was going on outside and looking in. And I'm really the only one that's written about that from the FBI and the government. So they came upon my book and basically, bought the rights for the Waco thing.
Yeah.
But they weren't really interested in the time at doing any more in the story than Waco. But, we'll see about the future.
So I had opportunity to interview David Thibodeau, and it was one of those interviews that I told him off air in sense that typically I'll get caught up in an interview and I'll just start nodding along. But he just shared some aspects of his vantage point that I did not feel comfortable just nodding along. However, within the miniseries and in your book, there were certainly some things that the FBI did or HRT that you may have disagreed with. How can you have better communication in such an intense situation, whether it's with the FBI, HRT, the drug enforcement? How would you suggest having better communication in these intense situations?
Well, I'm not going to speak for DEA or ATF or any other agency, but I will say this, that the FBI had long been a leader in managing major crises and sieges and had a phenomenal record in doing so very effectively and professionally. I would say Waco was a departure from that. We had some significant internal disagreements with the tactical commander and the on-scene commander, really, while on the one hand supportive of what my negotiation team was doing, he was also rather, the on-scene commander, supportive of how the tactical commander viewed going forward, which was very counterproductive to what we were doing. I mean, I think the tactical commander's view was, we're going to force these people to do what we want. And as a negotiator, I knew that was counterproductive. The paradox of power, the harder you push, the more you get resistance. But, going back for a minute to David, I met David on the set, and you've got a photograph of it there. We got along very well, and I think some people were surprised. I like David. I spoke to him on the phone some weeks ago. We have some different opinions about what happened and why, and that will probably remain. And I think we have those differences in a very respectful manner. I don't think David was in a position, since Koresh made so many decisions on his own, to really fully appreciate some of the things we were doing. But I have always been very candid about the mistakes that we made in the FBI that contributed to the outcome. What I do question is, I don't think on the other side of the equation, David per se or some others who take up the Davidian position have been as forthright and critical about Koresh and his more sinister dark side. In fact, the TV show, in my opinion, failed to some extent to accurately portray the darker, sinister side of Koresh. I mean, they had a little bit of that, but for me, that wasn't properly balanced. And I talked to the directors about it, and they assured me that it would get darker as we went along, but it really didn't, to my satisfaction. So again, I'm happy to look at what the FBI did. I'm happy to admit our errors, but I think for people to say, "Oh, this was just this wonderful guy out there, and the big old bad government came in to kill him," I think that's ignorant and naive.
Yeah. Hey, so in the miniseries, it has that connection between Ruby Ridge and Waco, and you playing a part in that. In your book, Stalling for Time, it does give some clarity, but just for the listeners today, can you just talk about that connection and how you were involved between that Ruby Ridge incident and then that of Waco?
Yeah, unlike for those who have seen the TV show, I wasn't at Ruby Ridge. I wasn't even there. My book makes that very, very clear. I was out of the country at the time. If it had continued on, my boss told me when I got back in the country, I would be going out there, but it ended before then. So, I mean, I wouldn't, but they had to do that in the TV show because Michael Shannon, the actor that played me, they couldn't wait to the second episode to get him involved. They had to get him involved right away. So there's some of that dramatic license. The other thing is, I'm shown as negotiating by myself, and there's a whole team of negotiators that function. And, and I was on the phone probably not that much compared to others. My role was to lead the team, devise the strategy, and so forth. But Ruby Ridge, I think, and I talk about it in the book, did have ramifications for Waco 6 months later. At Ruby Ridge, the on-scene or the tactical commander had issued an order that following the initial gunfight in which a U.S. Marshal was killed and Sammy Weaver was killed, Weaver's son, he issued an order that if any adults were seen outside of the cabin with a weapon, they could be shot. Deadly force used against them, which is unconstitutional. You can't just shoot somebody because they have a gun. You have to articulate that your life or someone else's life was in danger. So that situation, although terribly handled, was eventually negotiated out by my partner and the team that was out there. So that gets often overlooked. Anyway, the scandal that Ruby Ridge became didn't really hit the surface until after Waco, believe it or not. So that on-scene commander for the hostage rescue team was still in his position. He surprisingly had not been removed from that role. And so once again, his very aggressive, more militaristic approach on how to solve things was a big problem that I had to try to counter out there at Waco.
Thinking about what the country's going through now, not just in the middle of a pandemic, but certainly with the murder and death of George Floyd, the protests, the riots. How do you look at our country as a negotiator? How do you think we can have some sort of resolve as a country to begin the healing process, but to return to be a healthy country?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. It's a huge issue, and I spend a lot of time thinking about it these days. We have entered a period. I mean, politics has always been a rough and tumble activity, and the two-party system is sort of inherently created these perpetually opposing entities. However, it's so acrimonious now, and I think we have evolved, and social media plays some role in this. 24-hour news, another. We've evolved into a time where it is very simple to demonize those you disagree with. And to use names, a libtard, snowflake, socialist, or on the other side, you're a Klansman, you're a racist, whatever. And I really am bothered by the fact that whatever side of the political equation you are, you pick the most extreme examples of those that oppose you, and then you sort of apply that in a blanket fashion to everyone on the other side. For example, you mentioned the social unrest. Most of the people I think out there demonstrating are demonstrating in a peaceful and appropriate manner to what they see as social injustice. Yet there are some rioters and looters and arsonists, and they need to be dealt with. But I don't think they represent everybody that is expressing their grievances.
Yeah.
On the other hand, almost all police officers I know are hardworking, honest professionals, but there are some police officers who abuse their power and use excessive force. So for either side to sort of paint a broad picture of the other based on those two extreme examples that I just mentioned, I think is intellectually lazy and naive and frankly unfair. But that's what we do. And I'm reminiscent of particularly how the Nazis demonized the Jews in order to
Right.
at the build up to the war, to take their property and demonize them in the eyes and make it easier to do the terrible things that they did to them. And we're not at that extreme yet, but I'm worried about it. And I think the first thing I would suggest is to stop the name calling. It's just, I mean, I see it every day on social media. Oh, you bunch of libtards or whatever it is, and it's
Right.
like,
Right.
really, what does that mean? What does that even
Yeah.
mean? I was interviewed in a book some years ago, a couple of years ago, by Jamie Holmes, called "Nonsense: The Power of Not Knowing." And in this book, he profiles a bunch of people that are successful in life, and I was fortunate to be one of those. And what he basically is saying that successful people are comfortable in gray.
Hmm.
We don't have to have good guy, bad guy, yes, no. Life is rarely that clear cut and definitive. Life is full of gray and nuance and, no clarity. And so some successful people are very good at saying, I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
not sure. I don't have to mark my territory with a definitive position because it's a complex issue. And how I feel about something is very much dependent on what's the issue. And, not to digress politically, but somebody might ask me, are you a liberal or a conservative? And my first response is always, what's the issue?
Right. Right.
Yeah. What's the
Yeah.
issue?
Yeah.
I mean, if you label me one of those two things, am I supposed to then behave in a manner that you associate in your mind with someone who's liberal or conservative?
Right.
Well, I would characterize myself as depending on what the issue is. And some issues I might be found to be very conservative, and others, some might call me very liberal. So
Yeah.
I'm okay with that. And I'm okay with people who are like that. And I think in reality, most of us are like that. But it's quite easy in today's turbulent times for us to want to cut through that. That's hard to do. It's hard to work that out. So we just want to quickly say, you're a religious nut, or you're this, you're that, you're pro-life, you're pro-choice, therefore you're these things. It's lazy.
It is lazy, and those are wise words that I'm trying to learn and mature to. One day I'll get to that point where you are. Because I'm a Christian, people say, "Oh, because you're a Christian, you believe this or you do that." It's like, no, not exactly at all. I just want to transition back to the Waco miniseries.
Sure.
And as a negotiator, you mentioned, but did you speak with David Koresh?
Yeah, I flew out there the day it happened, February 28th, 1993. And we had a local FBI negotiator from San Antonio. Byron Sage was there already working with the ATF and the McLennan County Sheriff's Department. But I got out there that evening, and I ended up, I think, spending 10 or 12 hours with Koresh, negotiating with him on that first evening into the next day. And then after my team began to show up that I had called to join me there, then as the team leader, it's no longer my function to,
Right.
be on the phone. At that point in time, I take on a much more expansive leadership role in organizing the team, making sure we're getting the intelligence we need, devising the strategy that we think is the best approach, analyzing the calls, those sorts of things. So, yeah.
When
But I
you
did
get that,
speak with him.
when you got that call that you were going to Waco, did you realize what a quote Hornets Nest you were walking into?
I don't recall how much I thought, I mean, obviously, a lot of religious scholars will tell you don't even use the word cult. It's a pejorative, but I think it has some popular, common interpretation. So we keep finding ourselves using it anyway. But I knew that even though I didn't know personally about David Koresh, I knew such cults had typically were run almost exclusively by an individual who was, declared some special status in terms of interpreting the Bible or having a connection with God or being godlike. So those are all kind of familiar things, and it's really primarily a matter of control over every aspect of the lives of the followers. And certainly Koresh filled all that, and so that was no surprise. But the particulars about his beliefs and what brought him there and their journey, obviously those were things that uh, I learned more and more about as time evolved while we were out there. I was out there for the first half, during which my team got out. All 35 people came out when I was there, including 21 children. They decided to take a harder tack, and I was replaced, and no one else came out the rest of the incident. And that was recognized in the after action reports that we had it right, and we should have been allowed to keep up with that strategy. And the FBI learned 3 years later, we did an 85-day siege in Montana with the Freeman. And this time, that strategy that I led with my team was followed to a T, and everybody came out. No one was hurt. So it validated that we had the right approach, but it's unfortunate that, that approach didn't carry the day with FBI management during the incident at Waco.
Yeah, certainly. Just thinking about that experience you had with David Koresh, Waco, do you scratch your head and wonder how could anybody believe what he was saying or other, what we would say, cult leaders say? Or do you kind of find yourself saying, I kind of see or wish I could believe what they believe, but there's enough, what I would say, common sense holding you back from that vantage point?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I think typically the people we see that are susceptible to leaders like Koresh are not bad people inherently, but they're people who are searching for answers in their life. They're seeking a substitute for a family they don't have, to be part of a movement that they feel is missing, whatever it might be. People have different motivations, but there's people that are drawn into these cults, and then they begin to really subvert their own independence and their own thinking, and the cult leader cuts them off from family, takes their finances, and it gets worse and worse. I mean, there's Stephen Hassan has written several books about cults, and I did a podcast with him, and he explains it much further for anybody that's interested in learning more about it. But it becomes all pervasive, and next thing you know, people are trapped, and they don't have the inability to be critical thinkers. Hassan is interesting in that he was a Moonie way back, and
Right.
only by being in a car accident and having the chance to be in a hospital separated from that control were his parents at the time able to sort of bring him back from the brink and open his eyes to the fact that he was in essence being brainwashed. And and I think that's what's so tragic when you see otherwise good people go so far even as to almost place their children in danger,
Right.
give up their wives, give up their fortune, and to not be able to clearly see that they're being ripped off or conned. I mean, I don't want to get too political, but I see a little bit of that in our political discourse today as well.
I would agree. That's all I'll say about that. But yeah,
Yeah.
I would agree. I know for me, sometimes as a pastor, there's things that I don't share with my wife to either protect her or just so she could be ignorant and say, Jeff never told me that or anything. Were those things that you tried to protect your family from, not sharing with them the extent or danger that you were in?
There's some of that, but frankly, the larger issue, and I've been asked this before, is when I would come back from a not just Waco we're talking about, but come back from some tense situation, you're always torn between wanting to share that with your family, but on the other hand, you'd say, and there were times where my wife would say, well, you want to talk about what happened? And I would say, well, I just lived it for 2 days. I don't want to live it again,
Yeah.
and it would sometimes take a little while before I would open up or disclose more of it. And I wasn't necessarily doing that to shelter them or protect them, but I think my kids growing up had a sense that I did something a little differently than most dads. And they were proud of me, and they would sometimes see on the news and know that I was involved in what they were seeing. But I certainly wouldn't sit down and say, let me tell you what daddy did this week. It's just not the way it worked.
Now, I just listened to another podcast, and it said that people in general probably should have some sort of counseling just because we all grew up with things that we need counseling about. Was that important for you to have somebody to process what you had witnessed and been a part of?
Yeah, it was. I mean, I'd always taught that, and I didn't think I would need it myself. And then after Waco, I went through a challenging time, and I mean, how can you feel good about 70 people losing their lives? I mean, it's just a terrible, terrible tragedy. And I had, fortunately, some really incredible negotiators and mental health friends, two or three in particular that I would talk to quite frequently, who helped me, I think, deal with what happened and try to piece it all together and understand it. And eventually, I think I worked through that and came out fairly healthy. It's funny how many unsolicited emails I get now on my website where people saying, "Are you okay? Are you able to
Yeah,
function?"
yeah.
And I think part of that, Mike Shannon's wonderful portrayal, showed me. I guess you could assume it's damaged goods, and you know, uh, I appreciate the portrayal, but it might have overstated the case a bit. But I've always been able to function as a negotiator because of I'm sure you know it well, the Serenity Prayer. And
Yeah, yeah.
I've always accepted and understood what I can control and what I can't, and I live with that. And it's helped me in a few instances where there's been a loss of life early, and I see that loss of life begin to paralyze some people's decision making. And I've always tried to say, listen, we can't bring that person back. We're not God. We didn't make this incident start the way it did and cause somebody
Right.
to lose their lives. Our job now is to focus on what's ahead. It's kind of like a surgeon, I imagine, and a trauma surgeon in a war zone. You're seeing some pretty tragic things, and soldiers come in from the battlefield, and some of them have lost their lives already when they get to you. And you can't stop and cry and say, "Oh my God, this is terrible." You got to get on with the task of saving the lives that are in the
Yeah.
balance, and you'll learn how to compartmentalize that. I think a good negotiator does the same thing, and I think that's a skill that I don't know if I had inherently as my personality or I developed it later on, but
Hmm.
it certainly stood me well through my career.
Gary Noesner, author of Stalling for Time, portrayed in the Waco six-part miniseries. Where were you when you found out that the Waco compound had gone up in flames?
After I left Waco halfway through, I went home for a few days to Virginia where I lived, and then I flew off to the Middle East for something completely different. Um, and It was a long scheduled trip. It was a training trip, so I don't want to over dramatize it, but we were pretty sure we are going to have to cancel it because of Waco's own gone. Then when they sent me home, they decided to go ahead and send me to the Middle East. As soon as I got back, it was a day or two before the fire, or I think a day before the fire, and my boss called me up and he said, "Welcome home." Um, we were going to send. No, he called me up and said, "We're going to send you either back to Waco, or you're going to go to Lucasville, Ohio, where there's a prison riot and hostage taking going on, and I'll let you know tomorrow." And as it turned out, he said, "We're putting in tear gas tomorrow, so go into FBI headquarters to the command post." So that's what I did. I watched on the TV screens as the tear gas went in, and eventually as the fire was started by the Branch Davidians in response to that. And I was very angry. I was very, very angry that it had come to that. And I just got up and walked out and got on a plane the next day and flew to Ohio for a prison riot. So My life was pretty busy and tense during
Yeah.
those weeks in February, March, and April of '93.
Did you have concerns when they said that tear gas was going to be used?
Um, I, I I don't think anybody anticipated the fire, and
Yeah.
I certainly didn't. I felt as though, you know, and it's easy to criticize the FBI now, but there's really not a lot of tools between talking and going in and engaging in a gun battle. I mean,
Sure. Sure.
there's not a lot in between. People may say, well, what are all your other options? Well, there aren't a lot. And historically in law enforcement, the use of tear gas is one of those. And even in the TV show, they talk about how many fires have been started by tear gas. And I'm not going to say that hasn't happened, but I will tell you that historically tear gas is used all the time in local law enforcement situations without burning the city down. I mean, so, and that's one of the other things I disagreed with the TV show. They pretty much leave the impression that the FBI started the fire, and that's been clearly established. That did not happen. That was, and I know David doesn't agree with this, but the forensic arson investigation pretty clearly showed that the Davidians started the fire. Now they started it in response to the gas going in.
Yeah.
But anyway, that just needs to be clarified.
So I guess the only question that I'm going to ask that might get you in trouble, could get you in trouble, is the tenor of today. What I feel, my opinion, today's society is we would rather blame law enforcement than say that they are actually trying to help us in a lot of positive ways. We're patriotic as a family. Again, I have several friends in law enforcement. Do you think the miniseries like Waco does it injustice on, or does it promote the fact that law enforcement is to be questioned and not always has the public's best interest in mind?
You make a very valid point there, and I think there are those who will watch the show who will come away with a negative impression. It will perhaps reinforce their ideas about what happened out there. But I'll tell you from my point of view, Jeff, I've always been a big believer in the truth will set you free. The FBI is something I've always been proud to be part of. I wanted to be since I was a kid. The American people have historically held the FBI on a pedestal, and that has often been well deserved, and sometimes not so much. But it is a organization made of humans. It does good things and it makes mistakes. And I believe for an organization to serve the American people and to maintain a reputation, it has to recognize when it fails, and it has to be open about that. It has to take corrective measures to ensure it doesn't happen again. And yes, you take a hit on that. There's no question about it. But I just don't see what the alternative is. And, it's okay if some people, to this day, if I just talked to somebody yesterday, said, oh, I got to be careful what I say in the phone because you guys in the FBI, you got the ability to listen to anybody you want. And, you still hear that. You still hear that nonsense even today. But I mean, it's okay. But when I was a young FBI agent, I'd probably been on the job a week, and I was working in South Carolina, and I was looking for somebody to interview. And so I went to this neighborhood where was the last known address, and I knock on the door, and a lady comes to the front door, and I, identify myself and tell her what I'm doing. I'm looking for your former neighbor over there. Do you know where they moved, and so forth and so on. And she just looks at me for a minute. She says, would you mind waiting here for a minute? And I said, sure. Is there something wrong? She said, no, my kids are in the backyard. They've never met an FBI agent, and I want to go bring them forward. So she brings her two kids forward and said, kids, this is an FBI agent. Well, you can imagine, Jeff, I walked off that front stoop about 10 feet tall.
Yeah.
And, that was not untypical. And I think it's a good thing that Americans have a trust and faith in their government and the FBI. And when it's when you lose that faith, and we did at Waco, it set us back. It may be the most damaging thing that ever happened to the FBI. And we've got to we've got to step up to the plate and be better.
Yeah.
And a big part of my writing my book was a very big part was so that current and future FBI leaders will know what happened and understand the responsibility they have to, make the correct decisions that are in everyone's best interest, knowing full well that even when we make good decisions, sometimes good outcomes aren't guaranteed. But we have to show that we thought about what we did, we considered the pros and cons, we weighed the consequences, we did what we thought was the safest thing for the most people. And when you do that, you can stand up in front of a court of public opinion or a judicial court, and you can defend your actions and keep the support of the American people. And that's what we have to do.
Hey, Gary, a couple questions, and we'll let you go. Thanks again for making the time. Gary Noesner, the name of the book is Stalling for Time. Certainly watch the miniseries on Waco with or having read the book. I think it's going to enlighten you more. With your book, Stalling for Time, is there another story that you would like to see made into a miniseries or that you would like people to know about?
Well, that's a good question. Certainly the Montana story that I mentioned. And, it's funny. The FBI does a poor job with PR sometimes. 3 years later, when we had the Montana situation, I'm still at the scene. They literally just surrendered. And a reporter from 60 Minutes approaches me and says, we want to do a feature story on how the FBI learned from Waco and what a great job you guys did out here. So FBI agents aren't allowed to do any interviews directly unless given permission. So I called back to headquarters and I passed the word to our press people, and they say, nah, we're not interested. And I just about wanted to strangle somebody. I said, here we are trying to regain the American people's confidence after Waco. We have this wonderful opportunity to showcase our capabilities, and you guys turn it down. What are you, idiots? So I think that Montana was an important one. The first chapter of my book was a pretty interesting case that the Sperryville incident that readers may want to look at. But I think there's interesting cases along the way. And what I try to do is use each case in the book to sort of describe, something important about human behavior and how people behave in crisis and in stress and what we need to do to enhance the opportunities for us to be successful. You show Mike Shannon again. He likes the Amtrak situation I talk about in the book. He was saying, hey, we got to do another one about the Amtrak incident. So I'm certainly open to that.
And so I think the name of the movie is 12 Horses that Mike Shannon played in. And somebody said that he has the eyes that would kill, something to that effect, the line in that movie. Have you become a bigger fan of Mike's? Have you watched everything that he's been in? What's that relationship like?
I haven't watched. I'm sort of a little bit lazy in that regard. I've watched a number of his films, and we become friends. I just did a text exchange with him about a week ago, and he's overseas filming something else. He's just a very, very intense, interesting person, and an incredible actor. While I'm on the set, you see actors, they do takes over and over again of a certain scene, and everybody messes up and forgets lines and has to redo it. I never saw him miss a line one time. And what made it surprising is because I was out to dinner and drinks with him every single night, fairly late. And I don't know when he studied or memorized these scripts, but he was phenomenal. So that's hard work, no doubt, but he's also got a God-given gift there. And and he's a really good guy. And we'll see. He's a busy man, but I appreciate that he takes a little time for me. And I've seen him when I go up to New York. I get together with him.
Gary, thank you so much for making the time. Certainly a joy for me, and I just think it is appropriate, as David Thibodeau was on, to have you on as well, as both of your books helped with that Waco miniseries. But Gary, thanks again.
You're more than welcome.
And again, that's Gary Noesner making some time. If you have not received a copy of the book, Stalling for Time, make sure you pick that up. It's on Audible. That's where I first listened to it. Then I had to get a hard copy and reread it as well. And that miniseries, Waco, on Netflix. It's worth the watch, but I would certainly encourage you to read the book and then watch that miniseries as well. That's all I have. Jeff Fuller, Jay Fuller Interviews on Instagram, YouTube, the Facebook group, and Twitter. Thanks so much for subscribing and